Welcome. Welcome, welcome. Glad to have you in the room. We're going to get started just in about another minute. Thank you, Yolanda, for being here. I'm excited. Awesome. Well, it is 11 o'clock, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we've got a lot to cover today, and I want to be mindful of your time so that you have an opportunity to break before lunch and check out some of the virtual vendors, some of the networking opportunities, and other sessions that are going on. So I am going to get started. I am Janiel Youngblood. I'm owner of Janiel Youngblood and Associates, LLC. I operate a church financial consulting firm. I'm originally from New Jersey, and I came to Richmond, Virginia, where I live, to come to go to college. I went to Virginia Union University, where I studied accounting, and I absolutely had a great experience at Virginia Union. And while I was there, I had an opportunity to serve as Miss Virginia Union. And that gave me a platform to not just represent the school, but I really wanted to represent Christ in that role. And so I went home to my church in my hometown, and I was giving a testimony about how I just wanted to be used by God. I wanted, I was in this platform, but it wasn't about the title, it's about being used by God. And I wasn't sure what that was going to look like, because I'm not a preacher or a singer or any of those things that I thought was being used by God. And one of the elders at the church said, he knew that I was studying accounting. He said, "You're going to be a church accountant." And I was like, oh my goodness. And like a light bulb went off, like, oh, wow, I can actually like serve God with my technical skill of accounting. It was like an aha moment for me. It seems like such common sense now. But back then, I didn't see that as ministry. And I have definitely shifted my thought, because this is very much ministry, what I do in working with churches and helping churches to get it right. When I came through the accounting profession, it was during the time of a lot of corporations were having financial debacles and a lot of stuff going on, people cooking the books and things like that. And it just really made me think about, like, who's looking after God's money? Like, we're not accountable to shareholders and like the SEC or any of that, but we are like holding people's tithes and offering. Like, we're accountable to God for the money that we spend and how we manage it. And so I really wanted to make sure that there was a greater level of stewardship in ministry as it pertains to finances, and help people to really understand the practical matters of it as we incorporate the spiritual matters, but really taking hold of what are those practical principles and finances that apply to church. Because after all, church is a business, and it's legally recognized as a corporation. So we want to honor God by managing those resources correctly. And so one of the things that I studied when I went on to get my master's degree was church finances. I did my thesis on church financial management and what are some of the causes for the lack of it. And just really dug into this study. And what I found is that there was a need for the information, but not always a demand. And so that's what made me go on to get my CPA license, to build credibility, to get in the door, to really break down barriers so that people would trust the information that I was sharing and be more open to receive it. And that's what's led me here today. I've operated in this field for over about 20 years now. Been in business for a little less than 10 years, and have really found this as an opportunity to do ministry. So we're going to dig right into our topic today. It is about money matters. Church money matters, and why it's so important for us to get it right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I would encourage you to interact with me in the chat, ask questions. I get excited about this, so I tend to talk fast. So I encourage you to pause me, stop me for questions. I'll monitor the chat as we go along the way, but I'm going to drop some content on you. I believe that you would have received the handouts prior to. If you can just confirm if you've received the handouts already, that will help me know how much detail I need to go into as we journey about our topic today. As I'm pulling this up. Oh, you didn't receive the info. Okay. All right, we'll make sure you get it. Let's see, I'm trying to bring my screen up. with my content, which I'm having difficulty doing. All right, let's try this another way. Oh, I just saw it. Oh, I just lost it. Okay, bear with me, bear with me. Okay. Oh, I thought I had it. Okay, I'm gonna keep going and I will figure it out. It will work in Jesus' name. I'm gonna get it to work. All right, now you're seeing way too much. Okay, let me stop sharing. Let me try again. Okay, now you should be able to see my screen. Yes, can you confirm? You can see my screen, you can see the presentation. Yes, awesome. Okay, thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. Okay, so we're talking about money matters today in business. And one of the things that we're going to cover primarily is around budgeting, how we manage in the budgeting process, our transparency and accountability, and why that's important for financial integrity. And we'll touch on a few things as it pertains to the church tax and law and compensation and compliance and why that's important. So one of the things that I like to draw from the Bible and biblical principles that we can learn about managing money, and this is actually something that I wrote about in the book that was released this week on ministry that impacts, having ministry that impacts, in the book that Reverend LaKesha has put together with some of the authors for this summit. And I was excited to be able to talk about this topic. And as it pertains to what did blind Bartimaeus see, even as a blind man, I believe that he did have an opportunity to give us wisdom about what it means to stand in anticipation when you cannot see in the physical, but you have anticipation, you have vision in the spiritual. And what we can draw from this story is that he saw that he would see even before he received his sight. He knew that Jesus was coming and he positioned himself in a way to receive. And that's what I really think about as it pertains to budgeting. Being able to position ourselves with vision before we see it come into sight, that we're set up, that we're ready in anticipation for Jesus to come through, bless our house. And once we get blessed, we know what to do with those blessings. And so I really think about that as inspiration for us to be positioned to receive. I really think about that budgeting process as that positioning point. It is an opportunity for us to prepare and position ourselves for that. So what is the budget really? I mean, sometimes when people hear budget, they think of something being confining. They think of being restricted. But really, a budget is a tool. It's a financial tool that is helping us to allocate our resources. We're able to plan and control those resources and make wise decisions rather than impulsively making decisions. It's really guardrails to guide our resources, because when we tell our resources where to go, we never have to wonder where they went, because we're telling them where to go with the budget that we have in place. And so we really want to think about that. As I talked about positioning yourself, we think about the GPS. When you put those directions in the GPS, when you put that destination in the GPS, then it tells you how to get there, right? And so the budget is kind of helping us to position ourselves and navigate through how to reach the goal that we want to financially, even within ministry. So think of it just as a tool. It's not anything confining. It's really an opportunity to move forward. So I'm getting a response that you're not able to see the chart. Are you able to see the slide that I'm showing on the screen? You can confirm that. Okay, so some can see and some cannot see. Um, I'm not sure, Lucille, how to help you see what's on the slide. But I am sharing my presentation, and I'm going to ask Reverend LaKesha if she's able to share that with you. Okay, great. So let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger for you then. Okay, I want to be able to see that in the chat. Okay, so why do we have a budget? Proverbs 24:23 is a great resource for us to kind of think about the why. So Proverbs 27:23 says, be diligent to know the state of your flocks and attend your herds. So basically, this is about taking account, right? And I have this quote here that you cannot manage what you do not measure. You're not able to manage things if you don't take stock of where you are. I think about this as it relates to whether you're looking at your blood pressure or managing weight. You've got to step on the scale. You've got to take that blood pressure machine and check, right, to see where you are in order to understand where you want to go and how to navigate to get there. Luke 14:28-30 says, for which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. It's important for us to have a budget in order to protect the reputation in our community, to our banking institution, to our staff, vendors, and members. A budget indicates that we are being diligent, that we are, in fact, planning and being deliberate and strategic about how we manage these resources. So it's important for us to keep that in mind as it pertains to the why. It communicates that we are being thoughtful about our decision making and how we spend the money. And we want to protect the reputation of the church and not do things haphazardly and find ourselves in a position where either we have insufficient funds or we have things where we started a project and didn't have enough to finish it. That speaks to the reputation of the church. And so it's important to keep those things in mind. Now we've talked about the why and the what. Let's talk about the when. When is the best time to do the budget? When do you plan your budgeting cycle at your church? I first, recommend that we first determine what is that fiscal accounting year. Are we doing it January through December? Some people, some churches use a June through July. It really depends on what makes sense for your ministry. But whatever that accounting year is, that fiscal year is, you want to back up the planning cycle to accommodate your fiscal year plans. Let's say, for example, your fiscal year is January through December. You don't want to necessarily wait till December to start having that budget meeting. We want to give ourselves plenty of time to have the conversations that need to be had, to give some thought into how this budgeting process should work, and not just doing the same as last year. I talked about in the book, some churches use the Sally method, SALY, same as last year. So it's not always wise to do that. And if anything, 2020 taught us that it's not predictable year to year what will happen. So we can't just say, oh, we'll just make our budget the same as last year. No, we've got to give consideration to some of the factors that play into making a wise decision in regards to our budget. So some of the things that can be considered are, what are the needs of our ministry? Where do we have priorities for the upcoming year? Some of the other factors might be, what are some of those things that are happening in the environment? Are we having a situation where maybe a major manufacturer in our community is doing layoffs, and it's going to require us to do more in terms of packing our pantry or giving more benevolence to our community? And so those are some of the things to consider when we're talking about when to budget. You want to have time to have those conversations and really give proper consideration to what's needed to establish the budget. Now, when we're thinking about that budgeting process and we're looking at the income, I talked about some of these things in regards to what do we consider. You want to look at those metrics, look at those trends. Are we keeping good accounting records so that we know what the metrics are? Are we looking at the perspective of the timing of when things come in? Do we have data that tells us that? We don't want to go off of hunches or what we think. We want to have data and documented information to make those decisions off of. In the accounting industry, we say if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So we want to record everything. We also want to promote stewardship, not just for the sake of people giving to the church, but even for their own personal finances. I've heard people say, Oh, 10%. I believe in a 10% or more of a tithe. And so, if that's where people want to be, if that's where they're aspired to be, we have to be able to teach them how to do that, how to budget their own money, teaching personal financial literacy in our ministries so that people understand why it's important to give and how you can structure your personal finances to be a better contributor to the ministry. We also want to think about honoring designated funds. We don't want to necessarily budget off of things that are but are designed or designated for specific areas of ministry that are not continual every year. And that kind of speaks to that next bullet point of consider anomalies. If we have a situation where an individual comes into a lump sum of money and they make, let's say, for example, a $20,000 contribution this year, we don't want to necessarily make our budget off of that in the coming years, right? That's an anomaly because they might have come into a windfall of money. We want to be able to budget off of what's consistent and predictable as much as possible. We know that things happen, but we want to plan for what can be expected or measured and expect God for the increase in those areas that come as a surprise. And we'll talk about on the expense side how we also have to prepare for those downturns or those things that might come as an extra expense that we might not have pre-planned for. And as I mentioned earlier, considering the local economy, what's happening geographically in regards to, do we expect to see an increase because there's new developments being established in our communities? Do we expect new families to come in? So these are just some of the ways that you can break down that income projection as you take these things into consideration. As we think about those contribution types, what are those things that we do consider as part of the contributions? Of course, we're all familiar with just the general gifts and contributions that come monetarily, but there's some other things that we want to consider in regards to contributions. Number one, I want to also share is that services are a blessing. However, they are not deductible. So when people say they want to contribute their service to the church, that is not something that they can get a deduction for in terms of being recorded on their contribution statement at the end of the year, the value of the work they contributed. Now, if the church pays them for their service and they then in turn want to return it back to the church, then that's a different story because we've got documentation that shows that. But if we don't have that exchange documented as such, we want to be mindful of services. While they're a blessing, they're not necessarily deductible. We also want to keep in mind that gifts are not refundable. And so as people give money, they're releasing control to the church. And so that's money that we should be able to, as a ministry, be able to leverage as we need to. Donors can make designations, but not to the benefit of a specific person. So this is important as we think about contributions that come into the ministry. I cannot give a contribution and say, let's say, for example, to the youth ministry and say, I want this to benefit my child to go on the missions trip with the youth. If I'm giving to the church on behalf of the youth ministry, it's for whoever the church deems needs to use those funds. And that's how we keep things in the control of the church and also deductible for the donor. And then I think it's really important for the church to establish a gift acceptance policy. These policies and procedures are what keeps things in order, and it also takes the emotion out when decisions have to be made. And so we want to have an opportunity to have those policies and procedures established up front, not after the fact. It's always wiser to do it before it's needed, and that way you're not having a biased view when you're making those policies. Next, we're going to talk about what are some of those income sources. What are some of those areas that could be a factor in establishing where the income is going to come from? I've listed just a couple examples here: bookstores, coffee shops, parking lot rentals, tax credits, memorials, cemeteries, grant programs, cell tower, daycare, schools, fitness services, food services. I'm curious if you would put in the chat, what are some of the sources that maybe your churches use for income if it's not already named here? I'm curious if you have anything to add to that. Anything to add from the chat? These are just some example. One of the things that we have to keep in consideration as we think about these sources of income as well is some of the tax factors that come for unrelated business tax for churches. So we want to be mindful of that. Churches can use these income sources, but it cannot be the primary driver of the ministry. So we can't have our church become a rental property provider and making that the primary source of where we receive our income. In order to keep that nonprofit status, the primary way that income is received needs to be through gifts and contributions. All right, so I didn't see any additional sources in the chat. Maybe these are some of the things that you're already doing or things that you can consider taking back to your ministries as ways to establish some additional income. I have this little cartoon here. I think it's kind of cute. That's why I included it in my presentation. When we think about like stewardship campaigns and building fund campaigns, this is a little cartoon that says, how much should you pledge, or how much do you want to, or how much do you make, as you're establishing what to pledge. And then step 2 is send it all in. This should help us raise next year's budget. It's just kind of cute. I know some churches do use pledge cards for various projects that churches are doing. And I think it's a great way to establish predictable income as people are pledging a certain amount over a particular period of time, maybe a one-time contribution, or they pledge to have it taking out or given month to month. Some of the ways that we promote pledging, particularly for things like a built-in fund, is to promote how those resources are going to be used. Maybe you have a campaign that shows, or you do a little video clip that shows why we need this additional funds for the building, because there might be an area of the building that's breaking down and people need to see that. Even if you're not getting a new building, I think a building fund is always necessary because repairs are necessary. Things come up that require some additional funds for the building, or whatever that particular purpose might be. If it's to have a pledge to do missions work, are we bringing any footage as to how those funds are being used, letting people know perhaps they can't go on the mission field, but they can contribute to the mission work? Are we giving them some visuals? Are we coming back with testimonials of how those funds are being used? I think that's a great way to help promote good stewardship in those particular causes. All right, so we're going to talk about what are those keys for revenue success. Having that special occasion giving for those things like I mentioned, whether it's the building fund, the outreach, whatever that particular need is. Maybe it's to pave the parking lot, and we want to talk about why that's important, to help those to get into the building easier. As we think about those who might need assistance, we really want to be detailed, because after all, I started by saying that church is a business. And so part of that means marketing and fundraising, right? And so we want to be very descriptive about how those funds are being used and why it matters. Why does it matter to the donor that we contribute to these causes? And really find that point of connection with them so that they understand that these funds are being used for a particular mission. Mission and ministry fairs. This is about promoting what's happening in a particular area of the church. Talk about the great work that's happening and why people should give to the youth group, or why they should give to the particular ministry, to the food pantry, to the homeless shelter. Whatever that particular ministry or mission is, talk about it, market, play it up. Have video footage, have things that help to sell the sizzle of why that matters, for example. And I already talked about maintaining a building fund. So before we go into the expenditure piece, I want to hear from you in the chat. Let me know that you're there. Do you have any questions about the revenue portion? Is this resonating with you? Are you getting something out of it? Let me know. I need that interaction to know that it's resonating with you, that what I'm saying is meeting what maybe you have in mind, or what you're thinking about in terms of income for your church, or how you might better structure your income. Okay, I'm not seeing anything yet, but I see you're still there. Okay, so we're going to move on to expenses. As we think about the expenses, I got a question. What do you think about the church having a separate 501c3? I think that is definitely, I see that benefit a lot of churches to have something separate as a way to gain funds from organizations that are not able to give to religious purposes. So I've seen churches establish like a community development corporation where they're able to apply for grants or get corporate dollars to fund a particular purpose or mission that they have as a church. So that is definitely something that I see as a benefit for churches to establish a separate 501c3. Definitely is something that you can use to leverage corporate dollars and government grants and funds. Thank you for that question, Yolanda. So as we talk about expenditures and we want to evaluate how we're managing these expenses, every dollar, every expense that we record in our budget and on the books should ultimately be tied to the mission of the church. It seems pretty common sense, right? But how many of you know that common sense is not always common? So when I look at finances for churches and we're evaluating their books and making recommendations, I'll tell you all that one of my pet peeves is when I see things like late fees and insufficient fund charges and things that are not propelling the mission. Like it's really an indication of lack of communication. It's an indication of someone not paying attention to the details. And individuals who are contributing their tithes and their offerings, it should not be going to things like late fees and penalties and things like that. So I always say, like, let's just be practical about this and be good stewards so that we can tie every dollar to excel and to advance the mission of the church. We also want to evaluate the programs. Are they effectively working? Are the funds are the programs and the funds that we're giving to these programs, are they meeting the purpose? And so, yes, Yolanda, late fees for churches, unnerving, because those types of things don't help promote our programs. So another way I think it's important for us to evaluate programs is just because we've done it for the last 50 years, if it hasn't produced any fruit, maybe we need to stop doing that and do something different. Sometimes we get so tied to the loyalty of a particular program. If it's not yielding fruit, then we need to cut it off. I recently was drawn to the story in the Bible where Jesus cursed the fig tree because it wasn't bearing fruit. And so we want to make sure that we're not just doing things for the sake of doing it, but doing what's bearing fruit, investing the resources in things that are producing. And so that's what I mean by evaluating the programs. Do we need to shift gears because times are changing? Do we need to do some things different? Because of the pandemic, do we need to do some things different? So that's one of the things to consider is evaluating those programs. Establishing those guidelines and the governance up front. Like I talked about the gift acceptance policy, when you have these policies and procedures up front, it takes the emotions out of having to make a decision in the moment. A perfect example is the benevolent fund. When we establish those criteria up front of the types of things we're going to give resources to for benevolence, and how often we'll give to one particular family or individual, it takes the emotion out when that person comes for the 10th time asking for their rent to be paid. We might need to step back and think about a different strategy to help that person to either learn how to manage their resource or give them some additional support in other ways. But we've got to have criteria established up front that says we will give to X amount of, we'll give to families, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever that criteria is, but doing it up front rather than in the moment. The other things is the type of things that you will pay for if we're using benevolence. Is it that you will only pay for the needs and necessities, or will you pay for, what are those items? Establishing it up front, as I mentioned. And also, about who it goes to. I highly recommend that you don't give individuals funds for benevolence, that it goes to the agency or to the rental office or to the light company and not to the individual. Those are the types of guidelines that you want to establish up front for consistency, so that if Sister Susie comes, she's going to get the same answer that we give to Brother Leon. So we want to make sure that we're consistent in the way we approach things by having those policies and procedures established up front. We want to use restricted funds appropriately. If I'm giving to the building fund, then those funds should be used for the building fund. If something changes, then there needs to be a discussion about if there's going to be a change in the way that these restricted funds are being used. Too often we see funds being swapped without no transparency, and then we go to build the building and there's no funds in the building fund anymore because it was used for something else. So we want to make sure that those restricted funds are used appropriately. And then be aware of those hidden costs. Sometimes the number of things that we do yield a different cost than just buying it one time. And so we want to be aware of, is there a cost if we take, if we're going to take 5 students on a trip, on a missions trip, we might need to have 2 chaperones. Okay, but now we're going to take 20, so now how many more chaperones do we need to account for? That's not so much a hidden cost, but just really thinking through all of those things that could be, it might not be there on the surface, but as you think through the details, you want to make sure that you have that thoughtful planning in place. That's why we go back to the beginning of our conversation, having time to plan and think these things through is really important. So there's some keys I like to share for the expenditure success in evaluating our expenditures. Pre-plan events, right? And there's a theme here about planning, pre-planning. We want to make sure that we're giving time for that. I shared recently, I think it was in our book, the book launch discussion with Reverend Womack. I always tell people that someone's inability to plan does not constitute an emergency on my part, right? So a perfect example, a classic example that I hear in church is about when emergency funds are needed. Sometimes it is about, we need to have a check cut, right? Right away for this particular cause. Well, if we've got a rule or a standard that checks are only cut on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or checks are only cut on the Friday before, that Sunday, and someone comes in on Monday saying that they need a check, well, where was the pre-planning? Is this truly an emergency, or did someone fail to plan to go through the approval processes needed to issue the payment? So we want to pre-plan events and not always have emergencies come up. When it's time to issue those payments for expenses, we want to make sure that we're checking alignment with the budget. I recently sat in a budget meeting with one of my clients, and they were talking about bringing on a musician. And someone, the minister of music, told this person, oh yeah, you could come and be our drummer. But they never checked with the finance team to see, could we really afford a new drummer? It's not just a one-time payment. We're talking about bringing on an employee. That means additional taxes have to be paid. That means there's other ramifications. And so before decisions are made, we want to check alignment with the budget and not be impulsive. We want to consider time and talent stewardship campaigns. Who in the church has skills or assets that can help to contribute to reduce the expenses in the church? Are there opportunities for people to sow their time, even if they can't write it off or get a deduction for it? Is there an opportunity for them to sow their time to reduce the expenses that have to be given out as the church? So thinking about that. Although I will give a caveat, there are some things that the church should pay people to do when it comes to things that are important and having skill set required. When we're talking about something like electrical work or things that require a certain skill set, we want to make sure we're not putting anybody at harm by someone just volunteering their time if that's not necessarily their skill set. We want to be cognizant of usage of the building, usage of the supplies and equipment of the church. We don't want people coming into church using the copier to run off copies of their family reunion program or things like that. I mean, you'd be surprised some of the things that I see, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but sometimes we just have to kind of step back and let people know we're being cognizant of the usage. Another example would be opening up the building. I mean, now that people are returning back to the building for church, we want to be mindful of how many times are we opening up the building in the evening for rehearsals or whatever the case might be. Can we combine some events happening on the same night so that we don't have to turn on all the lights and turn on the AC and fully open up the whole building every night of the week? Maybe we can condense things and have certain nights of the week that we have the usage of the building. So those are just some examples. And then when we get it right, let's celebrate success. If we've come under budget, let's celebrate that. If we've been able to save in certain areas, let's celebrate that. If we've been able to partner with another ministry to reduce expenses, let's celebrate that. So just an opportunity to evaluate what are some of the success metrics. when we do have expenses come into play. And when it's time to crunch, we know that God's going to supply our needs, not according to what's in our checking account, not according to even the members' finances and what they have in their personal accounts, but it's according to his riches and glory. But there are some things that we can do to be strategic, be creative, looking for efficiencies, looking for grant funds. As I mentioned, partnering with other nonprofits that are trying to accomplish the same mission in order to reduce the cost on any one particular organization. And also looking at complete recovery events. Maybe we ask people to bring food to the event versus having the church buy everything. Maybe we look at some additional ways of not just what we're spending, but how we're spending it. Are there different organizations that we can partner with where we get a rebate or we get some return on how we spend money, or discounts or loyalty points, things like that sometimes we just overlook and we take for granted. We do it in our personal expenses. Maybe there's some opportunities to carry that forward as we think about the church's expenses. Any questions as it pertains to expenses before we move on? Put it in the chat. Let me hear from you. All right. As we think about the financial integrity of the church, this is really one of the hot spots for me. I really like to focus on this because sometimes we are a little too loose with church funds because we're very trusting of everyone who comes and volunteers in the ministry. And sometimes we have to be a little bit more wise and have a little bit more discernment about who is working with the finances of the church and making sure they have the right motives and that we've got the right processes in place in order to show good stewardship and really exercise financial integrity. So what are some of the benefits of having these financial controls? It's really about protecting the church, really protecting the church's assets, protecting the leaders, protecting the employees. And I talked about earlier, protecting the reputation of the church. We want to make sure that we have these controls in place so that we can have reliable financial information. We want to make sure that when we're recording this information and we're looking at the books, are we looking at good data? Is there integrity in the data? Because we're going to make decisions off of these numbers. We want to make sure that the numbers are good. I like to look at 2 Corinthians 8:20 and 21. It says, avoiding this, that no man should blame us in the abundance which is administered by us, proving for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. So it's important that we're getting these things right so that we are a good reflection to the world in the sight of men of our good God. And I always tell the churches that I work with, I want to make sure you're getting it right because you represent my God. We're all in this together, and I can't have you making my daddy look bad, right? And so we want to make sure, just like as our parents probably told us when we were younger, we going out the house, they're like, you represent me when you step out this house. Don't go out of this house looking like a mess, right? And that's how I feel about the finances of the church. The way our churches operate and how they handle their resources is the reflection of our God. And if one church messes it up and it gets blasted on the news, it makes all of us look bad. So I'm passionate about churches getting it right for the reputation of the ministry. So some of the elements of control. Yeah, I appreciate the comment. Leroy, when you're talking about everyone isn't honest when it comes to these things and comes to handling the money. And unfortunately, that's true even in the church, right? And so that's why we want to have these controls in place. We think about the control environment. Are we having the right environment for controls to be in place? Is the leadership of the church on board with us having these controls? Are we taking proper assessment of the risks at play? Do we have enough people in position to really help manage the control activities of the church? Do we have separation of those activities between the person who's handling the checkbook, who's dispersing the funds, who's signing off of this, who has access to the financial records? All of that's important. And then the information and communication that we're sharing out. We want to make sure there's controls around that because, as I mentioned, we're making decisions off of that. And then we want to monitor and make sure that what we're sharing and what we're doing, the controls that we have in place, that they're continuing to operate. That's really important. We don't just set it up one time and think that it's good. We've got to continue to check on it and make sure that those controls that we put in place are still operating as intended. I talked about this a little bit, having those separation of duties. The person who's authorized to sign for transactions shouldn't necessarily be the person who's updating the financial records. And that shouldn't necessarily be the same person that's keeping custody of the financials themselves, the person who's able to access the funds. No one person should have the ability to do all three of those things. We want to separate those duties as much as possible. And this is really because it helps with the reporting and the accountability. Who are we accountable to? God, the board, the members, the IRS. Even though the church is exempt from taxes, there still is responsibility as it pertains to who we give money to, right? Those employment taxes that are necessary to keep up with. And also we're accountable to our community and who we serve. So those are really important as we think about the accountability of the church and the resources that we're managing. So the church board has responsibilities. I think it's very important. I remember coming up in a time where if you were on the board of the church, that really was more of a status symbol than really understanding what the responsibilities were. And so I've outlined here, there are responsibilities that come with being a board member. It's the duty of care and loyalty, following the laws. Ignorance is not an excuse of the law. So you must know what the laws are as a board member, because you're ultimately accountable. Those board members are accountable for what happens with the resources of the church. And a duty of confidentiality for protecting that information that needs to be protected, but then also disclosing when necessary. If there's something going wrong, you need to speak up about it. If someone's doing things that are not full of integrity, you need to speak up about it. But there are some policies. I won't go through all of this for the sake of time, but I did touch on a few. Policies need to be in place. Definitely have those established up front. Some things that leaders need to know when you're looking at those financial statements and the financial information, you want to make sure that you know what you're looking at. Too often I've been in finance meeting and everyone gets the financial report and they're shaking their head and nodding and like, okay, looks good. But are they really evaluating? Are they really being thoughtful and analytical? Particularly the leadership needs to have some financial knowledge. They might not all be accountants, but they need to have some basic financial understanding because they are accountable for what's recorded on those records. And so we're thinking about things like liquidity ratios, like how quickly can we turn things into cash should we need to? How much of our funds are actually restricted or not restricted? Just because you see $1 million in the bank account doesn't mean that there's $1 million that the church can use. And that is why we want to make sure we separate what's restricted versus what's not restricted. And you're right, Leroy, like, do they understand the numbers? Oftentimes they don't. And they're taking one person's word for it, and that's not enough. We've seen too often where that has hurt the ministry. So we want to make sure there's a couple of people that can ask these hard questions or have that analytical view. We also want to make sure that we're not dipping into restricted funds. And if we are, we need to think about how do we recover from that quickly. Looking at our current balances on our mortgage and our debt and understanding how quickly we can pay that off. Are there, is the bulk of our money being used to pay debt? Do we have enough to continue to pay it off? These are some of the things that are important to ask when evaluating the numbers. Other key financial data to look at: how much of the salary and benefits are costing compared to the other expenses of the church? Do we have 90% of the income from the church going to paying salaries? That's a big no-no, right? We want to make sure that the bulk of our expenses are the programs and the ministries that we're funding. And there's a good balance between how much is going to people, that's salaries, versus what's going to being used for ministry and program purposes. Looking at that campaign and pledge data, trending reports. We talked about restricted and non-restricted funds. So these are some of the things that's important to know. As we wrap up, I see in the chat, yes, most don't know, and that's unfortunate. It's key for the leadership to have, yes, learning sessions and opportunities to come to summits like this so that they can learn and get the knowledge that's so critical for the success of their ministry. It's really, as the theme of this conference is about rethinking church, not just, from a spiritual matter, which is the core and the crux of our ministries, but some of these practical things that we want to be mindful of so that God can entrust us with more. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple of key points as it pertains to the employment and compensation pieces of this that too often gets our churches in trouble when it comes to taxes and tax evasion. I always tell people you want to get this part right because you don't want to see your church leaders inadvertently having a prison ministry, if you know what I mean. You don't want your leaders going to jail for tax evasion because the church didn't get this right, and now they're doing a prison ministry unintendedly, inadvertently. So we want to think about what is the difference between an employee versus a contractor. This is really key. We want to make sure that people understand that they don't have a choice between employee or contractor. It's really established by the behavior, the financial relationship, and the relationship of the parties. And so what do I mean by that? Who maintains the control? If the church is in control of how the work is done, how often it's performed, who is involved in doing it, those are some of the things that are part of the establishment of control, and more than likely makes the individual an employee. We often see employees are the ones that receive regular salary wages. They're the ones that can be hired and fired. They're the ones that must do the work themselves. They're eligible for benefits. They get reimbursed for expenses. So we think about those individuals like the associate minister or the custodial worker, where the church is providing all the resources for that person. Those are typically, not in all cases, but typically the employees of the church. They're the ones that we see that should be receiving the W-2s at the end of the year and having taxes withheld from their pay. Those individuals that are often legitimately the contractors, are the ones getting 1099s, are the individuals that set their own hours. They decide how the work is done. They often offer their services also to the public. They provide their own equipment. They can hire their own assistants. So things like that. I'm a classic example. I come into churches as a contractor. I do the work on my own terms. I use my own associates. I set my hours as long as I get the project done. So those are the ones that we want to make sure we're getting that W-9 up front and giving a 1099 at the end of the year. Here's some things to consider in the who. This is just a general statement. This does not apply in all cases, but just to give you some idea and for you to evaluate in your ministry, where do these individuals fall? So I just wanted to give you some context for that perspective. Who's considered the employee versus who's considered the contractor? It is not the individual's choice alone. The IRS does establish this for us, and often wants individuals to be counted as employees so the taxes get withheld up front. So we want to make sure we have that right. Ministerial tax responsibility. So one of the great benefits of being an ordained minister from a tax perspective is that you can exclude housing allowance from federal tax. So you want to make sure that's established up front. It's recorded in the board minutes before the payment is made. Those are all some of the requirements in establishing a housing allowance policy. You want to make sure that your ministers are recording all income received. All meaning all. So that means the pastoral anniversary gift, the love offering, the honorarium for speaking and doing the wedding, and all of those things are sources of income that ministers receive that should be reported. It also means that you can, when we're talking about recording all that income, that means you can also write off the expenses that come along with that. But the ministries must also include any income that's given as a non-accountable reimbursement plan. What do I mean by that? That means if you're getting money as a minister to go to a conference, let's say, for example, the church gives you $2,000 to go to this conference for you to use as you need to. You need to document how that $2,000 is used, and any excess is returned. If the church gives you $2,000 and says use how you need to, and you never report anything back, that's considered a non-accountable reimbursement and it's taxable. Okay, so I just wanted to establish that. It really means that you have to have documentation in place, and as I mentioned here, return any excess that is not used. When we're looking at the fair wage or the compensation that should be given to a minister, we want to take these things into consideration. Ministers should be compensated, and a worker is worthy of their hire. So we want to make sure we're fairly compensating them. But how do we establish that compensation? Here's some factors to consider. The income and attendance of the church, the service and education of that pastor, that he or she, what are they what is their background? What is their education? What is the cost of living in their area? What is their expected workload? Are they bivocational or full-time? Those are some of the things to consider. I have an example here, and I hope that we were able to work it out to get you all this slide information. This is just an example of how to structure a compensation package to benefit your ministers. As I mentioned, we want to pay the taxes that are due, but we also want to use the tax laws to our advantage to not pay more than what's due. So this is just an example how to structure that package to the advantage of the ministers that he or she is receiving their fair wage, but also taking advantage of the tax laws to not pay more than they have to. All right, I sped through a lot of information to get through it and wanted to make sure that I covered it all. So we have some time left. As I'm summarizing, we talk about the financial management, financial controls, compliance, and covered quite a bit. I wanted to leave some time for us to talk about any questions that you have. I see that we have 6 people here in the room. I want to, leave room for discussion, for questions. I dumped a lot and I did it pretty fast, but I really want to make sure that it's meeting the needs that you have in your ministry, or what questions you have, or some common things that come up in maybe your budgeting meetings, or pain points that you've seen in ministry as it pertains to finances. So this is your opportunity. Let me hear from you as I go through these last little things of some of my resources, my contact information. Janiel Youngblood and Associates, and you can find me on the web at Janiel Youngblood Associates with an S.com. You can also email me your questions. I would love an opportunity to talk with you and consult with you with questions you might have, and have set up a discovery session and see if there's something that that I could do or serve in your in capacity to help your church in any area that you might need. So let me hear from you. From those, if you have a question or a comment, was this helpful? Let me hear from you in the chat. It's kind of hard just talking to a screen and not having the feedback, so I appreciate. Oh, thank you so much for your comments. Great, good information. I'm glad that you found it helpful. What pain points are you seeing in your church, if any? Oh, I would love to do a virtual session with your church, Yolanda. I would love to. I get a lot of energy out of this. I miss being in person, but doing the virtual space allows me to meet more clients and to do more because I don't have to travel. So yeah, I would love to do that. Outside of the church, I'm not sure I followed the question. Oh, do I work with other nonprofits? So my niche is specifically with churches. That's where my heart and my passion is. So I specifically work with churches, ministries. So not so much other nonprofits, but if you have some general questions, I can help. I do have associates that I refer to as churches establish other nonprofits. I think someone asked earlier in the chat about churches establishing other nonprofits. And so when the church decides to do that, that's where I leverage my associates to handle those other agencies. It really keeps me focused and on my clientele to service just the church, and that's where I'm most passionate. So I want to stay in the lane that's assigned to me, that God has called me to, and allow my associates to help those that have other types of nonprofits. So still contact me because I could be a resource to help you find another CPA that I work with that can help in that space. What else you got? Thank you, Brandon. I'm glad that you found this helpful. Yes, and Yolanda, please follow up with me. So my pain area is helping membership to understand the importance of good record keeping and not doing things the way they did back. Yes. Bringing everyone up to date. And here's another point I want to share in regards to that. The way we used to do it way back when, and why we have to change and why we have to record things. It is so critical for church leaders to consider succession planning. I sat in one of the sessions yesterday about passing the baton and how to prepare the next group, or the presenter was speaking specifically about the next pastor coming on board, but I also think about it for the next generation of finance leaders. Sometimes we've got the elders in the church that have been handling the finances, and they've got all the policies up here and the way we did it up here, or things that they've been doing for years, but nobody knows it. Nobody knows the password to the accounting system, right? So we want to make sure all that's transparent to prepare the next person. or, when people go on vacation or things come up and you can't be there to write the check, like, are we preparing and training another group of individuals to pick up the reins? Are we staying abreast of changing laws and really keeping that education current? So it's really key about keeping that fresh and training and staying up to date and being transparent and recording the things that are necessary for us to continue the success and the legacy of the church. So thank you, Yolanda, for bringing that up. All right. Well, if there's nothing else at 11:53, got about 7 minutes before we transition to the next hour. So I want to just thank you so very much for coming in and being part of this session. I appreciate the chat interaction. It does help me out to be engaged and to know that I'm resonating with our audience today. I hope that this information continues to bless you. I'm sure we'll be able to figure out a way to get this information to you, and that way you'll have it to refer back to. But please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or I can be of any more assistance to you in your ministries. I would love to be able to do that. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a great rest of the sessions today, and have an awesome weekend. Take care.